And oh, thank you very much. Uh, Andy set up this brilliant project in Bradford called Sorted, reaching young people. And I've known him for a number of years now. And Nicholas used to work for him, Nicholas Levy, who's one of our pioneer curates now, and then set up a very similar project in Thamesmead. Having seen the light, he's now become ordained. But Andy, it's so great to have you here this morning talking to us about young people and reaching them. So over to you.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for your kind words, and thanks very much for the welcome, guys. So just briefly, a little bit about me. I became a Christian when I was 19. I live in Bradford, West Yorkshire, where I've lived most of my life. And as a young adult becoming a Christian, I felt that I was very much wanting to learn and grow in God. At the same time, I felt that God wanted me to be talking to people who I'd already got to know, people who I was already part of their groups, if you like, skateboarders and young adults in nightclubs, and sharing my faith. And I did a lot of that at first. Ended up becoming a church army evangelist, married my wife, Tracy, who I met at the local church. And just after our son, Sam, was born, just about 3 months, we moved to a part of Bradford where we felt God was calling us to start a youth church with unchurched young people. So I was looking at the title today about mission, FX, and engaging with unchurched young people. I was an unchurched young person until becoming a Christian at 19. And then I spent most of my life working with unchurched young people. So we developed Sorted, as Will mentioned, from about 2003 onwards, and I'll come back to that. And then sort of quite a few years later, we felt like people have said to us, well, you've got a bit of a story here, and we felt we ought to write about it. We felt God wanted us to write about it. So I started writing a story and then got a lot of help from a guy called Mike Milne, who's written a lot in Fresh Expressions. So we put this DNA book together. And then about 3 years ago, I found that God was moving me on to something different, and ended up being involved in a thing called Missional Youth Church Network, which again, I'll explain a bit more later on. But if we just if I can share screen with you a moment, better do that. And go to that one there. If we look back at some of the things that God's been doing in the UK over a long period, over the last 30 years or more, there's been this kind of move to create new forms of church. So when I first became a Christian, around that time, around 25 years ago, everything seemed to be about tell people about Jesus and invite them to church, or invite them to Alpha, or invite them to an event. And I thought that was what the whole thrust of mission and evangelism was. It was about getting people to come to something that we were putting on, that was usually part of existing church. And whilst that's got its place, it's not the whole story. And then I ended up going to Church Army College in the mid to late 90s and doing some theology on mission with a guy called George Lings. And George Lings taught us that the kind of whole come to us approach is very much Old Testament. It's very much like the idea of the temple, where God lives in the temple and everybody comes together 3 or 4 times a year to worship God in the temple. And that carried on into the idea of coming towards the synagogue. But then when Jesus comes along at the start of the New Testament, the whole emphasis switches, and it's about going out to people. Go and make disciples. Go ahead of me to the towns and villages where I'm about to go. Look for people of peace. Share the good news. And the phrase go is mentioned by Jesus over 100 times in the Gospels. It's incredible. A real thrust and to go and do mission out there. So in the last 30 years, there's been this sort of church planting movement, perhaps really gathering momentum in the late 80s and in the 90s. And I think a key part of that is about where geographically are people not being reached, And therefore, how do we send people to go into those areas to build relationship, share the gospel, and start new forms of church? And that's a really good thing. But alongside that as well, probably over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been this other movement of going, which has been the fresh expression movement. And that's more about, well, actually, there may be people in a geographical area that are completely unreached by the gospel, but there may be a massive percentage of people that are in an area where there is a church. It might be a thriving church, but actually there's a big percentage of people who just aren't on the same wavelength as that traditional church, that they need to hear the gospel in their own language. They need church to be developed in a way that is kind of culturally relevant to them, if you like. And the fresh expression movement, of course, works alongside the existing churches and church plants to develop new forms of church that are going to look very different and are very contextual. And I think that God is very much calling us to go and reach unchurched young people and develop new forms of church, fresh expressions of church with young people that are culturally relevant for them, and in new geographical areas and in existing areas. Youth work today, 2022. Youth work in the church has been declining for decades. I won't depress you with the details. Just to say, early 2019, there was a report that went to General Synod, put together by Jimmy Dale, which showed the kind of stark reality of where things are at. And then, of course, in the pandemic, with youth workers being hit again. And so there's a lot of people in the world of youth work at the moment in the church really thinking, what's next? What's God doing? There seems to be a bit of a crisis moment. But I also think that this is a time of opportunity. You know, if we look at that long picture of what God has been doing in his whole church over 30 years in the way that I've just described, with the church planting movement, the fresh expression movement, then I think this could be a moment of opportunity to re-look at youth work and say, what is God calling us to do for the next step? How do we go back to the Jesus approach of going to where young people are at, building relationships, forming new Christian communities with them where they're at? Okay, so that's a bit of background. I'm going to tell you now a bit about our story in Bradford and some of the things that we saw God do there, and what we learned from that. And just as an example, not as an example to replicate, but an example where some of the lessons might be learned that might be useful to travel contextually. So we moved back to Bradford, which was our hometown, late 2003, just with a very, very strong sense of God calling us to reach unchurched young people. We knew that there was something going to be about building relationships with them where they're at. We knew that in time we would kind of have to develop small groups where they could explore the faith. We knew that worship would be part of the equation at some point, but we didn't really know where to start, if I'm honest. We just had this burning conviction, one or two ideas, and not a lot else. Two things happened fairly early on. Firstly, when we were moving back into the area, we had a real sense that God wanted us to live in a particular area, and the house wasn't very good, but because we felt God wanted us to live there, we went for it. And we ended up with a group of young people meeting to play football after about 3 days. It was incredible. We never had that anywhere where we'd moved to before. So listening to God, even in those early things where you live and so on, is really, really key. The other thing, probably more fundamentally, was we knew we couldn't do anything and build anything without a team. And so straight away, I was linked to 3 local churches, and I started talking to the main church I was linked to and said, can we get a team together? Talking to the vicar. Well, yeah, of course we can. So I was up giving notices, asking people. And as you can imagine, people weren't exactly jumping out of the pews to get involved in working with unchurched young people. So I think we got about 2 people offering to help. So I went back to the vicar and said, what about us going and talking to the other churches, spreading the net, sharing the vision? So through chapter meetings and things like that, I would get in contact with different church leaders, other people from different churches. Nobody was willing to let me use the sermon slot to talk about youth work, but they were willing to let me come and do a notice. So I did that quite a lot at first. And I kept it really light. You know, if you're looking for volunteers to help with youth work, I would tend to say something like, well, this is the vision. You know, we want to connect with these young people. There's a lot of need here. We want them to discover Jesus. We want them to help grow together. Please pray for us. We really believe this is something God's calling us to do. But also, if you're interested in being involved, come and have a chat. Or even if you're just curious about being involved or you've got questions, come and have a chat over coffee. There's no pressure to join up. And we just kind of got conversations going. After 3 months, we managed to get together 6 or 7 people as the nucleus of the first team. My great plan was we would gather these team of 6 or 7 people for about 6 weeks. We'd worship together on a Friday evening. We'd do some teaching, it'd be interactive. And then we'd be ready to go and launch this youth church after 6 weeks. By week 5, I knew that this plan wasn't going to work. We got different people from different churches that didn't really know each other. Some of them had only chatted together once or twice. And there were some weird and wonderful ideas about what we meant by youth church. Really wacky in places. So I went home and I was praying about this and bothered about this. And my sense was just keep going with the training. So we kept going for several months. I have to be honest, as a pioneer, as an evangelist, I was thinking, have we made a mistake here? Shouldn't we have been doing a load of things? But looking back a few years later, it was the right thing to do. Because in those months together, we did a lot of social stuff. We built a real sense of community more than just a group of people that had come together to do a job. The trust started to be built. They trusted myself and Tracy as leaders. And in terms of the vision, we got on the same page. 1 or 2 people did leave at that point, which I was really worried about. That another couple of people joined later on who did get the vision. And looking back, we were in a much stronger place. We began to reach out to young people in different ways. As a team, when we'd done the training, we'd go out in pairs on a night and chat to young people in the local streets, in the parks, which wasn't very fruitful because the volunteers didn't really have the skills to do detached work. But as people who'd not been in touch with the world of young people for decades, it gave them a real insight into what was going on in the lives of local young people. So it was valuable in that sense. I'd been going into the local secondary school anyway, since we'd moved in, and bit by bit began to kind of start to get to know the young people. I'd kept asking the school, will you let me go into the playground, into the canteen? Because I'd love to just have conversations with young people. To be honest, they weren't very happy about that first because they thought, well, we're not just going to let some guy that we don't know that well loose in our school. So it took a few months, but eventually they decided they trusted me enough and set me free. I thought I was going into the playground and the canteen to talk to the young people about Jesus. I thought I was going to have lots of conversations about Jesus. And I was worried at first when it didn't happen, because that had been my experience through skateboarding evangelism years earlier. But I quickly realized that as a skateboarder in a skateboard community, I was accepted. So I could talk about Jesus straight away. As an adult as a stranger going into their space in the school, I was on their turf, in their space. And actually, I needed to gain trust. And the role that developed was more of a pastoral role, a chaplaincy role, listening. I spent most of my time listening to their problems, their hopes, their fears. And after a while became seen as a safe person that young people could go and approach and just chat with and confide in. But whilst that was happening and relationships were being built, I began to think, well, how's the good news going to be relevant for these young people? You know, where does it connect? Where's the connection points? And what might church look like as we develop it? Time went by and we started to gather our first groups. The first Friday evening group we gathered we got 8 young people come after about week 3. And we sat them down at the beginning and we said, hey guys, we've got this space to use together. What kind of things do you want to do? And they all looked a bit blank. So I thought, well, that's not very good. So throughout the rest of the night, then we had one-to-one conversations with them, and we found out some of them wanted to do arts and crafts, listen to music, skateboarding. There were 3 lads with England tops on holding a football, so that we knew what they wanted to do. So at the end of the night, we got them back together again and said, guys, we've heard what you want to do. We've got some money as a group. How do you want to spend it? Very dangerous question to ask young people. But what it led to was, over the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'd meet young people in pairs or in threes. We'd head off to a sports shop, buy some sports equipment. They'd come round to our house. They'd order stuff online. We wanted them to be involved in everything we did from day one. We didn't want to do anything apart from build community. We got the equipment back to the group a couple of weeks later, and our next question was, okay, who's going to run the football game? Who's going to organise the arts and crafts? To which they all looked a bit at me blank, as if to say, well, you're the youth worker, isn't that your job? So we had conversations with them throughout the night, and pretty soon we ended up doing the stuff together. They'd organised the football game. We'd join in to make sure that it was fair. They'd organised the arts and crafts with the help of a couple of adults. We were building community. We were sharing faith through testimonies, through little talks, through video clips. But as the group grew, and it grew quite quickly to about 30, it all seemed to go wrong. There was a lot of behavioural issues. There was some of the young people that were new coming in. They weren't very interested in listening to the talk about God. So we got to the end of that summer, and our prayer was, Lord, the vision's a Christian community. This is a crowd. You know, show us what to do. It was like we didn't really know. Our key Bible passage, we felt we'd had this key Bible passage before we started, which was Luke chapter 10, about going to people, looking for people of peace, young people of peace who are open to God and open to us, building relationship. And suddenly what happened over the next few months was we ended up, without really thinking about it, we ended up finding ourselves with young people who were people of peace, those who we were getting to know, those who were interested in really being involved in what we were developing. And we formed some little groups with those young people over the next 6 months. There were 2 girls who came round to our house to talk to Tracy about girls' issues. And because there wasn't another adult available, I ended up having to be the co-leader, which was not very good when they were asking about all sorts of issues to do with girls' developments and boys' developments and everything else. It was the least enjoyable group I think I've ever been part of. But there you go. There was another group where there was a lad at school who was open to God. I really sensed he was a person of peace. So we gathered a group around him on a Wednesday afternoon. And because of his openness to God, other young people became open. We had another group like that on a Tuesday evening. And then there was a different group as well. In all these groups, it wasn't big conversions, but in all these groups, seeds of faith were being planted. Some young people were starting to get on a journey of faith, and relationships were being built between the young people and between the young people and the adults. It wasn't massive, a massive move of God or anything like that, but there was the embryo of a new community starting to form. Time went by. We did our first residential the following summer, and it happened to be at Soul Survivor. Only took about 5 or 6 young people. The 4 of us as adults all came back with a real strong sense that God was nudging us to start some form of worship. This was really tricky because we'd got this crowd of 30 meeting on a Friday night, and we thought, well, we can't do worship with them because it'll just be complete chaos. So what we're going to do? So we gathered together on a Monday night in our house, 4 adults, 8 young people, big sheet of A1 paper. I'd been talking one-to-one to these young people during the week before, and there'd been a definite sense in which some of them were ready for that next step with God. So we gathered them together and we said, right, how are we going to do this worship? Which was a challenge because the 8 young people were all unchurched. They didn't know how to put a worship service together. but we wanted them involved because we wanted the ownership. So I would say things like, well, we need to have some teaching from the Bible, and I would explain why that's a good thing in their language. And they would look at me and say, yeah, Andy, that sounds like a good idea, but it needs to be fun and interactive. Okay, fun and interactive. And then I would say things like, well, and we need to develop this worship. And I would explain about spiritual engagement, again, in their language. And they would say, yeah, that sounds really good. We could do that, but we need to have a break in the middle of the session. Otherwise, it could get a bit long. So we put this plan together and we started out doing worship. And at first, it was very messy. We had several young people who had been kicked out of school, short concentration spans. Some weeks worked really well. Other weeks, it was really, really difficult. We had some people from the local churches wanting to come down and see what was happening. And I was like, no way, not at the moment. But the thing was, whenever we did the prayer time, we did this prayer ministry, and the young people really engaged and connected with God. And that was when the spiritual lights came on. And so we adapted things. We made sure that that was a key part of the service. And bit by bit, as the young people connected with God, they became much more attentive when we were doing the talks later on. What amazed me was, at first, even though it was really messy, within a short period of time, the young people actually adapted to the routine and the ritual almost of a worship service. We had to keep it very basic at first, but we were soon able to add other elements. The numbers at the worship service grew, so much so that we started in September. By the following June, the bishop came and baptized a load of the young people, and things had moved on quite a lot in a few months. As the young people came through to the worship service, we realized that we got a pattern here that was working, if you like, for unchurched young people to come to faith. Meet them in the school. Let me just move that onto that journey, because the pattern mirrors this learning journey from Fresh Expressions. Meet young people in the school, listen, build a relationship, which is this loving and serving, then bring them together in the Friday night, which is like a community. And as time went by, more and more, we would involve them in the running of that community, in their ideas, and then being involved in the leadership and the team. Exploring faith in small groups, which became much more solid and as time went by. And then as the young people came into the worship, they would often come to faith. And as soon as they came to faith, we wanted then to involve them back in these other groups as team members and young leaders where appropriate. So we'd take them into school sometimes and get them involved in helping us with the school session. We'd have young people being part of the team running the Friday night session. We'd have young people helping with running the small groups, asking questions. And what happened with that is that the whole thing started to feel much more like a community when the young people were involved in leading and being part of the team. And it was the best thing we ever did in terms of evangelism, because once 15 and 16-year-olds were doing a prayer, asking questions in a small group, being involved in setting things up, as the 12 and 13-year-olds started to come in, new young people started to come in, they would see these older young people involved in running things, and immediately that would make them more open to God, more open to being involved. So that's how the whole thing got going. The thing that happened afterwards was a couple of years down the line, somebody asked us to get involved in another school a mile up the road. And my first response had been, no, I'm not going to get involved in that because I'm too busy doing this first thing. But the thought wouldn't go away. So I asked some people to pray about it. And this lady had a vision saying, Andy, God's giving you the key to open the door to a mission field that's been shut for a long time. And as we tested it out, we really felt that was this other secondary school called Hanson. As I got involved in that, it became clear that we had the opportunity to do a second Youth Fresh Expression. So we talked with the local churches, and we had another team that came together from those local churches. About that time, Nicholas, who was on this call, came and joined us, along with another guy called James. And James helped with the first Sorted, if you like, and Nicholas and myself pioneered this second Sorted, which was really exciting. Of course, when you're redoing something, the temptation is just to copy what happened the first time round. And we would kind of determine that whilst we would learn lessons from the first one, we weren't going to just replicate without paying attention to context. We wanted to listen to the context and change things and adapt things as needed. Just the final thing about that story is to say that in a few years after that as well, the first young people from the first Sorted were becoming young adults. And I remember one Tuesday night going along and sitting with these 19-year-olds and seeing they were all looking a bit down in the dumps. And I said, "What's up with you guys? What's bothering you?" And they said, "It's them over there." I said, "What do you mean?" And I looked around and there were the 14, 15-year-olds being a bit daft, running around, doing exactly what the 19-year-olds would have done 3 years earlier. And I challenged them, but I realized they needed their own space. So at first, we learned that there were two 19-year-olds going up to a pub quiz after the main Tuesday session. So we joined them and encouraged others to go up and form a little group, which was great because it provided real opportunities to have conversations away from the younger people. But then another problem arose a few months down the line. As we'd looked after the 18, 19, 20-year-olds, young people from the school stopped coming to the group because they got put off by seeing these young adults there and thought this is not a group for them. So we realized we needed to do something different. And we ended up beginning a new youth fresh expression, if you like, in the first area where we began, and allowing that first fresh expression, which my wife Tracy and I began all those years earlier, to become a hub for young adults and young parents. So we ended up three things, but then we would often join together for worship and things like that, whilst keeping the missional stuff for young people, young adults and young parents separate and distinct so they could be contextual. So that's a bit of my story and the story of what we've done in Bradford. I'm going to just pause it there, stop sharing for a moment. And before I share the next bit, I just wonder whether this might be a good point just to open up the conversation. If anybody's got any questions or comments, before we carry on.
Thanks, Andy. Anybody got any questions or thoughts?
I just want to say, if I may, first of all, that sounds like just incredible work and very inspiring. I don't know if I've got any questions more than I've got like thoughts and feeling like questions for myself, I guess, because there's things that I feel I'm being called to do, and so it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to listen to other people and what they're doing, and it just sounds amazing. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Hayley.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what it looked like with the traditional forms of ministry that was already there, parish ministry. How was you received? Did you complement each other? Did you clash? Yeah, that kind of thing, really.
Yeah, I mean, when we first started, there was a lot of kind of people that didn't really get what we were doing. I think things have moved on a lot since then. So we did things like we take young people to different churches on a Sunday morning, interview 3 young people, and we always found then the congregations would really warm to them, and vice versa. And we'd often go to the churches as well and say, thank you for supporting us, thanks for your prayers. As time went by, we'd do things like joint baptism and confirmation services. sometimes some young people got involved in helping out with holiday clubs in local churches. And something that was ongoing, which was challenging at first, were like local partners meetings, and to try and we would give update reports on what was happening. We'd all pray for each other, and we'd make sure there was good communication all around. So we had to work quite hard at that, and we had some, to be honest with you, it's important for me to be honest, because you guys are pioneers as well, and you might come across similar things. But we had a lot of problems in the early years. Sometimes sleepless nights before them local partners meetings. One thing that did really help was we got a bishop's mission order. And that was like the bishop stamping his authority and saying, this is what sorted is, this is what it's not, effectively work with it to everybody, us included and others. So that's how it was back then.
Great. Nicholas, could I bring you in at that point? Because of course you did something very, very similar in Thamesmead, and I know it's not the same. Bradford is not Thamesmead, Thamesmead is not Bradford, but actually Southwarkizing it in a sense, bring it into Southwark, that Andy's vision and mission. Do you want to quickly just share how it was for you in Thamesmead? I know Patrick's here, but you could ignore him.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, thank you, Andy. Thank you for all the inspiration that I got from you. So I came to Thamesmead, and as Andy said, I thought, gosh, this is not like McDonald's where we kind of franchise, we do the same, it feels the same, it tastes the same. So what do we do? But the principle, I guess, was the same. It's about listening to context and praying, and also getting people involved. So I was listening to the young people. Like Andy, I got myself involved in this local secondary school. The bishop at the time was even worried because it was a Catholic school. So how is this going to work? Don't create confusion. But so amazing. I mean, I went in with no agenda, just to serve them and to build relationship. And as I got in, the school gave me opportunity to do a lot of stuff. And again, I met young people there, and Andy used the word crowd. And so I began to meet people in the community. And I came back at this point, I'd formed a volunteer team of about 14 across the 3 churches. And another thing that we did with our volunteers was also the fact that a lot of them were scared. We were in a very tough, area where aggressive young people and people were scared. So I remember going to the churches and share the vision. And I said, this is what we're going to do. But there are 4 things that we need in order for this vision to work. Just to encourage everyone, I said, and they all start with 4 P's, or they started with P. So we need a premises, we need people, we need pounds, and we need prayers. I used to say pennies, and bishops, they don't say penny, they don't give you enough money, say pounds. So a lot of people came. Some said, well, we can volunteer by giving you money, we can pray, we don't have youth work skills. And I said, well, you don't have to have skills to do this. I can train you. So the 14 people that came forward, for 6 months, we didn't do anything. We just met and prayed. Like Andy said, I said to them, these are individuals that have come together. In order to minister as a community to these young people, we have to become a community ourselves first. For 6 months, that's what we did, prayed and did all the training and stuff. The whole time I was going into the schools, making all the connection in the local area. And then as we began to meet more young people, I said, okay, well, what do we do? And then I came back to the volunteers. I said, I think it's about time we start our youth club. And so with their support, we prayed. And after 6 months, we felt it was right. And I remember we launched our first night. We had 45 young people there the first night. And then it began. And so the same principle, you have a crowd. How do you turn a crowd to a community? And out of the community, you form a congregation. So that is a process that we followed. And so over time, I was in the school, I was in the community, and we're getting to know these young people. We started a Friday night youth club. And the aim was that we know that young people respond and what happens when they respond. And the idea is that we'll start another group. So from Friday came the Tuesday, if you like, an inquiry group, going more in terms of faith. We did a youth alpha, took them to Chichester Diocese, Chelsea for weekend away. They came back, God met with them. It was incredible. Then took them to Soul Survivor. They came back, the young people themselves made a video and they said, we want to start our own church. So out of the Tuesday, we then started a youth congregation. And at this point, we began to have 3 nights. So it's similar to the model from Bradford. Brilliant,
Nicholas. Thank you. I mean, do get hold of Nicholas if you want to kind of have a kind of the local expression. Patrick, Nicholas, I can't remember who's running it now in the church, are we?
So now it's Karen Saunders.
Oh, Karen, that's it. Yes, yeah.
Who was the parent of one of the youth in TY.
Yeah.
And so she's now carrying it on. It's still very much the same model as before. There's a sense of building it back up again now because COVID sort of everything ground to a halt a bit during that, with the school being closed and so on. Yeah. So there's a sense of rebuilding it, but essentially the same model. It's still
thanks. Andy, sorry, that was a kind of a slight detour, but I just thought it might be useful for people to hear that it's not just in Bradford. Sometimes these things can feel, far away places doing far away things rather than locally on our own estates. So I think it's important to do that. Any other questions or thoughts that anybody has?
I was absolutely entranced, Andy, by your story. Whilst I'm busy making a cake for my 15-year-old today and doing all sorts of other things, builders and stuff, but and unfortunately I lost power just at the point at which she was saying what worship means for young people. And I have my own project that I'm doing now, but for years I've been thinking about, if you asked adult Christians that question, there's such a range of answers that obviously it would be the same amongst young people. So it's sort of, one's worship is very personal and very, culturally conditioned, but I think also personality conditioned. So I'm going to have to listen to the recording to see what you said after that.
I do.
At what point a group moves into what you would term worship or almost explicit faith, that's a sort of murky area for me, because the gathering itself and you're being a pastor to them by these years of work and patience and building up trust and love, for me is also a form of worship. So it's always this question of what we call what at what stage, if you see what I mean. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm sorry, I missed the last sort of probably 10 minutes of what you said.
No, it does. And I know there's the whole thing in the, is worship the service, or is it a bigger thing than that? I think just 2 things, just picking up on what you said. One is the trying to foster that spiritual engagement, that ongoing spiritual engagement, because the young people that got that would start to connect with God in that space, in essentially just creating a space for that to happen. And the ones that did it again and again, they're the ones which could see the real transformation, and particularly some of those that have got really difficult backgrounds and real hurt and pain, seeing God change that as they kept coming into that space, that connection with Jesus. But then in the outer form of worship, whether it's Soul Survivor style, we know Soul Survivor's stopped as a festival now, or whether it's something different. The thing I learned down the years was that different groups of young people will like different styles of worship. And the important thing was, 2 important things really. One was to keep checking out with them. What do you think you're here to do? Well, we're actually here to have this worship, spiritual engagement. Get that clear, and then almost say every now and again, right, what do you think's working well? What's not working well? What do we need to change? And so some groups down the years would hate the prayer ministry, Soul Survivor stuff. They would not engage with that whatsoever. That they might do a sacred space prayer meditation and sit on their own and with music and somebody talk through a prayer meditation. Or another group might like to rewrite some liturgy or that, and we're not even getting into different styles of music. So having that regular conversation with them. But the other thing as well was the involvement. And again, the thing I saw down the years was no matter how often you do it, and with all the best intentions, adults leading things tend to drift back to something becoming more staid, regular, and taking over things. probably not meaning to do. It just always seemed to tend to do that. So again, touching back with the young people and making sure that the young people are fully involved and having ownership seemed to be really key.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? David.
Andy, I love the fact that you, as in the book, you've used the circles to reflect on where you've been, and I think I find that really helpful with pioneers. I know it's not a rigid model. I know that you never quite go in a perfect order all the time, but I think it's really, really helpful. So that I thought it's really useful, because actually seeing how does this unfold and where do we go to is really useful. The bit that I got today, which I'd never really thought about before, which is really useful, where you go to that last circle where you do it again. You know, often we're trying to encourage pioneers to think about how might you create a sorted 2 or a sorted grown up or a sorted 3, or where do you go and repeat the process of the whole thing. But what I really loved was that you were effectively saying, I'm trying to get, once young people have got to some stage of discipleship, I'm trying to get them involved in earlier stages. So they're actually doing again what they have already experienced. So I thought that's really accessible for individuals. That actually they're doing it again isn't, we've all got to go and start a fresh expression, a new one, which is great. But how do we encourage our young people to travel that journey by going, well, you've done this, we've done this, why don't you come and do this so that we can do this again? I thought that was really, really helpful. So thank you. I've learned more, as I always do. So thank you.
No, thanks, David. And the learning's mutual, definitely. I mean, just another thing we spotted on that journey as well, which has tended to be useful, is, you know, particularly with young people, things fall down. I mean, Nick knows this really well. You know, you look back and you think, well, actually, this bit of the journey, which we thought we got sorted out before, suddenly it's not working very well now. So we've just started to say, when we're gathering youth workers and pioneers, is saying, well, actually, another way of looking at it is, if you feel like you've traveled the journey once and you've got all things set up, is look back and say, what's not working as well? Where do we have to revisit? And as you say, it's not always a nice, exact linear process, but more or less it works, doesn't it, in some way? Shall I go on to the next bit then? Because
That'd be great.
We've done a bit more thinking, you know, about how to help other people, basically. So a few years ago, Phil Potter, who used to head up Fresh Expressions UK, started chatting with Archbishop Sentamu, he was then the Archbishop of York, and basically with the question of how do we help people, youth workers, churches, dioceses, to set up fresh expressions for young people. And I remember being one of several people roped into joining a meeting, and Phil said, just come along and share your story. And thinking that was it. And then over time being invited back, and then several of us came together and realized that actually God was calling us to do something to help people in other parts of the country develop fresh expressions with young people. So Missional Youth Church Network was formed 3 years ago, and it's a bit wordy, but why is it called that? Well, have you come across the values missional, contextual, ecclesial, formational? Probably some of you have. Well, the missional is missional, the youth is the contextual, the church is the ecclesial, and we think a lot of the formational stuff happens within the network, if you like. And so we're trying to sort of go to people, we get a phone call, we go to sit down with church leaders, somebody, youth workers, somebody in a local area, pray with them and say, well, let's pray and see, well, what might God want to do? And then think, well, how could we enable you guys to develop something that is missional, which starts by going to where the young people are at, that is with the young people, it's not just for the young people, but is very much got that ownership, that becomes community and becomes Christian community. And what that looks like could be very different in different places. So I'm just going to throw some quick examples out. So a guy in Leeds here called Neil O'Bard was appointed just before the pandemic to start something that's missional with young people that develops Christian community in a big tough estate called Seacroft in Leeds. He was held back a lot by the pandemic, but he's now developing stuff with a team in school in the area, developing community there. And we're not sure what that's going to look like at the moment, but it's probably going to develop something that's with some sort of youth community on a Friday evening. I'm just going to mention the one in Birmingham here. There's a group that was existing doing youth work in Knoll in Solihull, Birmingham, before we ever got there, headed up by a guy called Paul Holden. Penny's Cafe, it's called. And they got involved in our network because they said, well, we want help to develop something that's more missional, that's got deeper discipleship. So their way of doing Penny's Cafe is after school groups with young people, sort of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then they do other things as well. But they've got involved with us because they want to figure out how to make that more missional and go deeper in discipleship and develop deeper community. So in a sense, we're learning from them and they're learning from us, but we come together. But I wanted to give you that example because it's very different from either Sorted or TYM. And then just throw another couple. I had to have a picture from TYM here today. I couldn't come on a call with you guys in Southwark and not have something there. And even better that Nick's here. I just want to say it was absolute joy working with Nick. Those of you that know Nick, it won't surprise you, but he is so gifted and such a prayerful man. You like Will said earlier, if you don't know him yet, you must talk to him and ask him about what he did with TYM and what he's doing now. And if the final thing I'll just say about Nick is he's so much fun to work with as well. Even the toughest situations with young people, he would still find a way to laugh and bring something, find the funny side out of it. So there you go. And then just give a final example. Well, just two other quick examples. One is on the other side of Bradford from where we're at, a parish which has had nothing going on for 2 or 3 decades. And 4 churches have come together, gathered a team to do church planting. And then Pam, who's in the forefront of this picture, and the vicar there who's just to the right of her, who used to teach mission-shaped ministry courses, felt that there needed to be something for young people. So I've done some training with them. They've appointed a part-time youth worker, and they've no idea what this is going to look like across these 4 parishes. But they know it's going to be missional, it's going to have community, and they're going to be developing discipleship. But again, we're waiting to see. It's a blank sheet at the moment. But a last example I just want to mention, I couldn't get a picture of this, otherwise she'd have been on. It's a lady called Lucy who is working in a rural setting, 4 churches, 3 miles between each one of them. She finds herself in a youth and children's role, having never done a paid role before, not very confident. And if she hears examples like Sorted or TYM, she's actually said to us, she said, it frightens her, because she said, there's no way I could ever do anything like that. So the first thing we did when we gathered her and some other people together was to say, let's get it clear. God's not calling you to do something like that. What God's called, let's be clear. We believe together, don't we? God's calling you to do something that's missional, that is with young people, that grows Christian community. And so our job together is to try and figure out what that might look like in your context. And she's now growing and developing and flying, now that she's kind of thinks in that different kind of way. So that's a few examples. Very briefly, how do we start with folk? As I've hinted at earlier, we try and form a local partners group to pray for the work, to support the work, but also because whenever you're starting something new, fresh expression with young people, There's a lot of enthusiasm at first and a lot of excitement, but it wanes. People get distracted by the next thing going on in church. So we felt keeping a local partners group together keeps the conversation going on, keeps the feedback coming from the work on the ground. It allows people to ask questions, solve problems together, new vision and new ideas to be fed in. When new volunteers or funding needs to be found, the local partners group, praying and listening, discerning vision, as we said earlier. And then a key thing is forming a local team, a volunteer team. And we've produced a resource which uses that learning journey that David's just talked about again, and helping teams to kind of understand how a youth work approach to following that learning journey. And the whole key to say to the team is to say, explore the journey, and then think through how you might begin to listen and love, how you might begin to build relationships in your particular context, how you might begin then, when you've built those relationships, to form the beginnings of a community. We also offer some mentoring and consultancy support. And then finally, just to say, we gather people together 3 times a year in a learning community that's both in person and online. So we try and meet in different places so that people can come in person, but then we've got it open to people from across England and Church Army in Wales to come to Zoom in. And the key part of the learning community is, yes, we have some teaching and input, but he's always saying, well, where are you at the moment? Where's your youth work? Let's chat about that in groups. Let's ask the question from the learning journey. Just going back to that, he's saying, where do you think you're at on that journey? And where might the Holy Spirit be nudging you to go next? And exploring that with other people, exploring ideas and working out together through prayer and through discussion with different youth workers and other people, pioneers, what to do next. And then everybody goes away with an idea of what to do for the next 3 months, and before they come back together again. So that's just a little bit about how we've tried to take the learning from places like Sorted and TYM and put it in a way that can actually help other people. So yeah, just wonder if it's good to kind of open the conversation back up again. Any more thoughts, comments or questions or disagreements? Very happy to be disagreed with as well. That's how we learn.
Andy, could I just thank you again for all of that, but I'm just wondering, because I think what I'm understanding about just what you've just been saying is that it's a really powerful kind of framework that you've put together, if you like, that's kind of enabled you in your own learning and everybody else's as well, and that is specifically working with unchurched young people. But I'm kind of like thinking that in my situation, it could also be a kind of framework that you could apply to other kinds of work as well. Like, for example, if a pioneer wanted to do some work with Spanish-speaking people, I'm not that I am, but I'm just kind of that's off the top of my head, as in kind of understanding where the pioneering is going. If we have in mind that sort of kind of framework to understand the journey of what we're doing, the context. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think it's helpful anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that journey certainly is useful. I mean, it's come from Fresh Expressions with the purpose of being used in lots of different contexts and situations. I mean, we're trying to use it in a sense, like with the resource that we've written. It was, how do we give something that has the best of the Fresh Expressions journey, but also has the things that we've learned and other people have learned from a youth work context, and put them together. So I often say, well, the journey is the skeleton and the youth work learning is the flesh. That's one way of looking at it, but yeah, I agree with you completely.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions or thoughts? Jan?
I really like that phrase you use, listen and love, and the fact that you'd sort of gone through the learning journey, you know, through the various rings of that, but kind of never lost that listening to the young people and listening to God and loving them. You know, that's, I mean, I work with families, but, you know, that really rung a chord with me that you need to keep on with that listen and love all the way through, even when you've been doing it a number of years.
Yeah, and of course, particularly if people have, well, young people, we all need that anyway, don't we? But maybe young people in particular, because adolescence is such a challenging stage of life.
Yes.
And then if you're working with people in tough contexts as well, that's, you know, it's almost like they get whole, but they're still, well, we're all whole, but still broken, but it's even more, isn't it, with people who have grown up in tough contexts?
Yeah.
You know, I think, and yeah, you never lose that.
Mm.
I'm really interested, Andy, how you think, because I'm just aware that most people feel quite brutalized at the moment with various things, particularly thinking about COVID, post-COVID. Things were pretty tough before then, and now with all the pressure economically on people, it's difficult to know when many of our churches and those involved in fresh expressions feeling quite exhausted and burnt. I'm just wondering where, and people are passionate about this subject, it's quite difficult to start when you feel like you're at the end of yourself. I just wonder if you have some thoughts about how do you start this when lots of things feel quite overwhelming about our context at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And just with the youth workers that we're connecting with, it feels like everything just took such a big hit, and almost everywhere, even though they're restarting, it's not back to what it was. I wonder whether we just have to start small. I mean, I had a real privilege of talking to people in Ireland the other week, and we were talking about exactly this thing about everybody being hit by the pandemic. And it's the first time I've ever been to Ireland to talk with anybody, but the thing I had when I was praying about it beforehand was just about small steps all the time. You know, just let's not think too big. If we can't do that at the moment, that's too overwhelming. Let's just try and start small and take it and just listen to God, take a step, reflect and learn, and hopefully as well. I mean, I just find as well that Sorted at the moment is quite small compared to what it used to be. And that's okay, because we are where we are. And I go and help sometimes as a volunteer, but there's energy there in the small stuff. I feel I get energy by going along and just being part of the small. And yeah, sorry, I ain't got much more wisdom than that, really.
I think related to that is that of finances, Andy, because I mean, a lot of these, you know, if you're starting something, there's costs involved. So how did you afford all of this?
I think that's a really good point, particularly at the moment. And I mean, we were really fortunate with the Sorted. I started as the paid worker, then they brought in a new thing with Church Army of Centres of Mission, which was wonderful, because then Nick came along, you know, as part of his training for Church Army. James came along because of this training centre, but that wouldn't happen at the moment. The one thing that did come out of that, which is why I'm mentioning it, which was we had lots of cutbacks. Church Army pulled back a lot of funding after the Great Recession, and there were more cutbacks. But because we'd done this by young people for young people thing and seen young people grow, we ended up with a couple of young people becoming part-time youth workers and finding funding from local charities. So we had to do a lot of fundraising from local charities. But bringing it up to 2022, as well as trying to diversify where your income streams and looking at local charities and that type of thing, there's a lot being said at the moment about how do we empower volunteers even more. And of course, in the long run, it's going to be, isn't it, about how do we grow young leaders? And maybe, so someone said to me many years ago, everybody looks for a youth worker, a really great youth worker to come in from somewhere, whereas maybe we actually need to, across the country, think, how do we grow young people up and how do we develop them as the next leaders, because the pool is drying up nationally. So yeah, volunteers, diversifying funding, growing young leaders up, which is a long, slow process, isn't it? And
I think you're absolutely right, Andy, because I think it's I think everyone's finding this. Obviously, I have grants that I give for Fresh Expressions, and we've given one to TYM, but it is going to be an ongoing struggle. But I think that's a really important thing you brought out about developing our own. In my old church, our best youth leaders were not people we brought in from outside, but were people that we developed internally in the church. And each generation seems to have the trend as what is trendy. And with the cutbacks in youth provision in our councils, there isn't a natural place for youth leaders in the church to go into, because that's where often you start off in a church and then go off into local authority, places like that. That seems to have closed a huge amount of those. And the church is therefore ending up being one of the biggest providers.
And there may be an opportunity might be, because of this. I mean, again, we've noticed in Bradford that years ago, the youth services weren't that keen to work with church youth workers, but now they're much more keen because of their cuts.
No, agreed.
And again, thinking more locally, Nick, you had a lot of success, didn't you, with developing young leaders with TYM. So again, there's another story there to tap into.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts?
Just say there's a challenge for the church at a higher level as well, isn't there, in terms of where it invests its money as well. I mean, we've got the growing younger as one of the strands that's coming out with the new Church of England policy strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting one, because that's something that we grapple with in Southwark. I mean, it's really interesting that an awful lot of our fresh expressions of church are around families, young people. Very high percentage are involved in those. And the pandemic also has brought great problems for the church, because a lot of churches are finding their families have disconnected during the pandemic because young children don't want to do online. And so those churches that have done best are those that have actually said, our families aren't coming back, we need to go out and reach them. So places like St. Barnabas Dulwich or Ascension Balham have done some great work along those lines of actually going out purposely and reaching families and children and youth. And I think this is really important, Andy. I think we have to keep grappling and keep fighting for this, and knowing that children are a key element to any healthy diocesan church.
Yeah, there's the old thing, isn't there, of which we've kind of known for years, that most people that make a commitment become Christians.
Yeah.
Something like 75-80% do it in the teenage years.
Yeah.
And even though people go away, sometimes recommit later on, it shows how important prioritizing that age group is. Yeah, don't get me started.
No, I agree with you, Andy. I mean, I think we have we really do feel people like J. Cole, who's canon missioner responsible for children and youth, he and I both have a real heart for reaching our children and young people in the diocese. David.
Yeah, I'm really struck. It's something I think we've got to think about, us and Jay, a bit more, is Andy's comments are a valid one, that the church nationally wants to grow younger, but all those moves in the central church are meaning that it's falling to the diocese to work out how we're going to do this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a particular challenge is how can we spot and nurture young people to be potential leaders of these missional churches and fresh expressions. And I think there's a whole bit that we might need to think about there.
Just a quick comment. I know, sorry, Sharon, you got your hand up. Just coming back on that is because we feel this empowering young people is such an important thing, we've got a bit of funding. We've just employed somebody part-time. And part of that is we want to set up a couple of residentials, 2 or 3 residentials a year, just for young people who might be becoming young leaders or want to get involved more. And some of the stuff that's come out nationally for young people becoming leaders seems to be a little bit like there's an assumed that there's got to be a lot of Christian knowledge, or they're already being leaders. We're wanting to say, well, actually, we're wanting to develop a resource for young people who are a bit more, well, we're just wanting to get more involved. We don't have the Christian knowledge yet. So, yeah, if there was any interest in that down the line.
That's really good to know about.
Yeah. That was really interesting, Andy. And just before Sharon comes in on that one, the other thing I found when I was at Springfield was that we used to use growing leaders, and we brought in some of our teenagers into that. And it's really interesting. I don't know of any of them who are part of growing leaders who didn't grow in their faith and are now, years later, still committed in church, often in leadership roles. So actually that mixing of youth and adults, where adults can play a really important part in encouraging and supporting young people rather than totally, I mean, sometimes you do need to take them off on their own, I totally understand that, but sometimes bringing you in that way can actually be really helpful. So Sharon, we kind of drew you apart.
We've slightly moved off the subject now, but it was just something on, I suppose, the importance of involving children and as leaders. In my other part of what I do, I'm a childist scholar, so looking at the biblical perspective, asking child-centered questions. And it's really striking that the Gospel of Luke starts with the shepherds, and there's a recent childish scholarship argument article on it, which talks about how the shepherds were almost certainly not old men who were kind of not part of society. If you look at every anthropological and archaeological evidence, those shepherds were almost certainly children. And actually, if you think of even the biblical stuff, like Rachel and David were shepherds in the Old Testament, most shepherds were children. And so actually, when you read the gospel from that perspective, it's really interesting because the good news first comes to a bunch of children. And actually you can tell as children, because then what do they do when they hear the good news? They run, they run to the stable. But what's really then striking is at the end, they then go home, which of course, if you were kind of a reject from society, you wouldn't necessarily do this next bit. They go back to their homes and the news of what had happened spreads through the whole community. And for me, that's always inspired what I do, because children, they have that ability, they're little influencers, and they get into every part of community. The one definition of being a child is that you are interdependent. You're never independent, you're always connected to somebody else. So I think that side of it is important to remember as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just comment on that? Because that's, I mean, you know, when you start a youth church kind of thing, the team, the adult team is so important. But then as you develop, you know, we talk about involving young people, and we've made so many mistakes on this down the years. And I really come to a place where I think 50% adults and 50% young people working together is much better than, say, just 80% young people leading with just one adult or two adults on the sideline. and involving different, and within a team as well. One of the most effective members of the team was actually a lady who's been known as Grandma Val, and she's 85 now. And some young people would confide in her as that wouldn't confide in me, because see me as more parent figure, and she's like a grandma figure. And I just think there's a real place for different ages of people in the church to help and get alongside young people. So I'm glad you've said that, because it's really important.
Brilliant. And if you've, I mean, I know Nicholas has started one, Andy obviously has started one. You know, I did one in my curacy. It is really hard work working with detached youth, and there's all sorts of challenges, but it does change how you see things, and it does change how you see people. And you know, if you have the opportunity, in my case, I just noticed because they were hanging around the church after church outside and causing mayhem. And I remember thinking, well, surely Jesus would do something about that, because he's always, when he bumps into people, that's when the encounters happen, aren't they? And so, you know, maybe look around your own scenario. Where are you bumping into people? Who are the people you bump into? Where are the young people or the people at the corner of your eye that you notice? Any other final thoughts or questions? Is there anything else you wanted to finally say, Andy?
No, just thanks for listening. It's been great to come and share. I think Will, Ian and David, we touched base and talked about doing something for years, haven't we? In some way. And just to say, if there's any other way that me or NYCN can help you guys in the future, just let us know. You know.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm sure we'll be back in touch, Andy. I mean, we are looking at lots of other things going on at the moment, and as I said, children and young people are definitely on our horizon, as are young adults as well. So starting in the autumn, I'm hoping to start an initiative around young adults, because that is another left behind area. So we love children, that's the easy bit, cute and cuddly. Teenagers a bit harder, but once we get to university and beyond, we kind of, oh well, ho hum. So I'm going to start some stuff in the autumn, hopefully, to help us think how we might reach young adults in the diocese. Catherine.
Just briefly reflecting on both what Sharon said and then Andy, that I think the power of an intergenerational model is very it's very relevant for a post-COVID, let's hope we're post-COVID society, because I think a lot of connections have been reworked, rethought. Communities have got some new lease of life, or particularly with the environmental crisis, you know, crushing us. We've all realised in so many different areas of life how important the locality is, and also how important intergenerational contact is. So I think just as a model, we have to be, to use Ian's phrase, you know, it's very easy to think about the attractional model of church and think about, the church is dying and we need young people to support it. But actually I just think there's huge richness in mixing. And like you said, Andy, the granny figure became a very powerful person for that particular context. We all need each other. We all need to learn that children thing, don't we, of being dependent, you know, on others. So I just think there's a great place for not always treating young people and youth on their own, in their own group, I suppose is what I'm reflecting.
And I just want to say a big thank you, because I know you're a busy man, and it's been great to have you here with us. We learn a lot from your years worth of pioneering. You still got hair, unlike me, from all the stress of doing it all. So I'm impressed with all that you're doing. I really appreciate all that you shared today.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure.
No, great. Thank you so much, Andy, for this morning, and or even this afternoon now. It's really, really kind of you to spend this time, and really good to have you here with us. And I'm glad we got the recording, so we will send that out to everyone so that you can at your leisure have a relook at it and rethink it. especially if you're thinking about anything to do. I mean, it's not only about young people. Obviously, that's Andy's main key area, but as Deborah said, it is applicable elsewhere in terms of the way we do it in Fresh Expressions. So thank you all so much for the time.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Sharon, Ali and Jan, can I borrow you for a second at the end of this for 5 minutes?
Yes, definitely.
Okay,
Thank you, Andy.
thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. See you
Bye.
later. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, so much.